What if the part of you that once leapt out of bed chasing goals is gone, not because you've failed, but because you've healed? Most people assume that a sudden loss of motivation signals weakness, depression, or laziness, but Carl Jung saw something deeper. He believed that the collapse of external drive after shadow work is not a breakdown, it is a breakthrough. When the old fuel of fear, shame, and people-pleasing burns out, the fire goes quiet. Not because there is nothing left to burn, but because the soul refuses to keep running on borrowed energy. You are not broken. You're in transition. Your inner engine, the one that pushed you to succeed, prove your worth, or chase approval, was never truly yours. It was built from unmet childhood needs, invisible expectations, and unconscious wounds. When those begin to heal, the machinery comes to a halt. You may feel lost, unmotivated, or even numb. But underneath this silence is something sacred. Jung called this space the liminal, the psychological hallway between who you were and who you are becoming. Here, nothing feels urgent. The goals you once chased feel empty. The hustle you once glorified now feels exhausting. But this emptiness is not failure. It is proof that the false self is dying. The question isn't, how do I get motivated again? The real question is, what kind of life am I ready to stop performing for? In this journey, we will uncover why the disappearance of your old motivation is not the end of your ambition, but the rebirth of your truth. What if the moment you let go of someone or something wasn't just painful, but felt like a complete identity collapse? Not just sadness, but confusion, emptiness, and a haunting question echoing in your mind. Who am I now that I'm no longer chasing this? This is the invisible grief most people don't speak of. It's the aching silence after you stop performing, the eerie stillness after years of running on emotional adrenaline. You think you're mourning the loss of a person, a dream, or a path, but what's really disintegrating is a carefully constructed version of yourself that was never truly you. Carl Jung believed that we unconsciously build our lives around what he called shadow projections, internal fears we reject and then project outward. You may believe you were striving to be a good partner, a top performer, or a strong parent, but what if, underneath all that effort, was an unconscious desire to prove you weren't weak, unlovable, or destined to be abandoned? This false self becomes a persona, your survival mask. And when the relationship ends or the job disappears, that persona crumbles. What you lose is not just a role, it's your emotional scaffolding. The collapse is not about laziness or lack of direction. It is the psyche withdrawing false energy, asking you to stop proving and start feeling. And that process is brutal. Imagine the woman who poured herself into a marriage, not because it made her feel alive, but because she needed it to prove she wasn't unworthy of love like her father once made her feel. Or the man who grinded for success, not out of joy, but because a childhood wound whispered, "You'll be nothing unless you win." When those relationships or careers end, it's not just heartbreak or burnout they face. They also face the challenges of rebuilding their lives. It's a shattering of meaning. They look in the mirror and don't recognize who's looking back. Why? Because the projection is gone, and all that's left is the real self, quiet, unfamiliar, waiting to be met. Letting go, then, becomes more than a decision. It becomes a psychological death. The old ego can no longer sustain the illusion, and the soul takes over. Jung warned that this is the moment most people resist. They run back to old relationships, chase new distractions, or numb themselves with overwork or addiction, anything to avoid the hollow space where the persona once lived. But this very void is sacred. It's the space where the individuation process begins, where we stop living from fear and start living from essence. So ask yourself, who are you when there's nothing left to prove? What remains when the roles dissolve and the applause fades? Can you sit in the silence long enough to hear what your soul has been trying to say all along? This is not the end of you. This is the end of who you thought you had to be. And though it feels like a loss, it is actually the clearing before emergence. You are not collapsing, you are returning. And the self that is waiting underneath the debris is not only more real, but more whole. Letting go doesn't kill who you are, it kills who you are not. What if your next purpose doesn't look like a mission, but feels like a quiet curiosity? Not a grand vision that compels the world to applaud, but a soft thread tugging at your soul in the middle of ordinary moments. Many people, especially after 35, report something strange. They no longer feel urgency around the goals they once chased. Instead, they find themselves yearning for slowness, meaning, and something they can't quite name. They begin tending to gardens, picking up brushes, writing forgotten poems, walking with no destination. These aren't distractions, these are soul movements. And according to Jung, they are signs that the unconscious is beginning to speak. We have been trained to respect only things that produce. If it doesn't create money, status, or certainty, we dismiss it as wasteful. But Jung believed the soul does not speak in deadlines. It speaks in symbols, and its first language is often stillness. After years of performing to survive, many find themselves feeling guilty for wanting something simpler. A woman in her 40s might leave a high-paying job to run a small cafe, not because she failed, but because she finally succeeded in hearing what truly mattered to her. A man approaching 50 might start composing music late at night, not to become famous, but because it quiets the ache he never knew had a name. These aren't breakdowns, they're breakthroughs. True desire rarely arrives with fireworks. It shows up in moments that feel strangely alive. When you're reading a passage and feel your chest open, when you sit under a tree and time disappears, when you hear someone speak truth and your whole body leans in. These are not small things, they are invitations. Jung called this process individuation, the slow, unfolding journey of becoming who you truly are. But here's the irony. It requires surrendering who you thought you were supposed to be. What if the next chapter of your life doesn't look like success at all? What if it looks like peace? What if your gifts were never meant to impress, but to express? Would you still follow them, even if no one clapped? Would you still create, even if the world never watched? Would you still listen, even if the voice came only once a day, at sunrise, in silence? These are the questions that separate the ego's ambition from the soul's purpose, and they are not answered through force. They are answered by presence, by noticing what gently returns when the noise fades, by trusting the subtle over the dramatic, and by recognizing that the things you once called distractions may have been your true compass all along. So if your desires feel quiet lately, don't rush to fix them. Sit with them, water them, let them grow on their own terms. Like seeds buried beneath the soil, they don't need your performance, they need your patience. The soul does not shout, it waits to be heard. And once you begin to listen, you may realize your real life has been. Why does real alignment feel so eerily quiet at first, almost like nothing is happening? Shouldn't the true purpose roar to life with passion and fireworks? And yet, when you finally stumble upon something that deeply resonates with your soul, it often arrives not with drama, but with an unexpected stillness. For many people who have spent decades being driven by anxiety, perfectionism, or the need to prove their worth, this shift into inner alignment can feel disorienting. You're no longer sprinting, you're listening, you're no longer reacting, you're sensing. And that silence, at first, can be mistaken for emptiness. Carl Jung taught that when we move from ego-driven striving to self-led resonance, we enter a completely different psychological operating system. The ego, conditioned by fear and urgency, thrives on noise. It gets its fuel from needing to become something. But the self does not operate in that realm. It does not push. It pulls. Its energy is not frantic but steady, and that can feel deeply unfamiliar to someone whose worth was tied to constant motion. So when your real motivation begins to surface, it might not feel motivating at all. It might feel like exhaling after years of holding your breath. Consider the story of a man in his early 60s who had always worked in corporate sales. After retirement, he found himself listless for months, unsure what to do without quotas to hit or clients to impress. Then one day, while walking through his neighborhood, he noticed how neglected the local park had become. Without thinking, he picked up a bag and started collecting trash. The next week, he brought a shovel and replanted a few wilting bushes. By month's end, children had started returning to the park. He never planned it. He simply followed what felt meaningful. And in doing so, he stumbled upon a new form of fulfillment. Not recognition, not ambition, just resonance. That is the paradox of real purpose. It often feels underwhelming at first because it doesn't flatter the ego. It doesn't promise applause. It doesn't chase validation. It simply fits like a puzzle piece, sliding quietly into place. And because we have been so trained to equate aliveness with adrenaline, we may overlook the quiet knowing that arises when something is truly aligned. We may even resist it, doubt it, dismiss it. But the truth is, this calm, grounded clarity is what our nervous systems have been starving for. So, if you feel a strange sense of stillness where you expected excitement, pause before you judge it. Ask yourself, am I truly bored or just no longer addicted to the chase? Am I really uninspired, or am I finally safe enough to hear what actually matters? Could this emptiness be sacred space, not something to fill, but something to honor? Real motivation is not a roar, it is a return to what calls you without noise. A return to what feels nourishing even when no one is watching, and that quiet pulse within, that subtle yes, might just be the voice of your soul saying, now we begin again, but this time with truth. Why is your calm mistaken for collapse? There comes a strange moment in life when you stop proving and start pausing, and suddenly people worry about you. They say you've changed, you seem distant, unmotivated, disconnected. But what if they're not witnessing a breakdown but a breakthrough? What if your quiet is not giving up, but waking up? Think about how often we equate motion with meaning. In a world addicted to urgency, stillness feels threatening. When someone stops chasing titles, milestones, or even relationships that once defined them, we assume something must be wrong. She lost her spark. He's going through something. But what if the something is actually the beginning of becoming? Carl Jung understood this subtle yet radical transformation as individuation, a psychic rebirth where the false self crumbles so the true self can emerge. It is not dramatic. It is not glamorous. It often begins in silence and is misread as stagnation. But inside, the soul is doing sacred work, shedding personas, unlearning expectations, listening not to the noise of the world, but to the whispers of the inner voice that has long been buried. Let's ground this in real life. Imagine the man who walked away from a prestigious law firm after 20 years, not because he failed, but because one day he could no longer silence the ache in his chest. He remembered the cabin his grandfather built, the smell of cedar. The afternoons were spent carving wood by hand, so he left the courtroom and became a craftsman. His colleagues said, "What a shame, all that potential gone." But they didn't see the peace in his eyes, or the woman who finally left a 20-year marriage where she was never really seen. Her children, now adults, didn't understand. "Why now?" they asked. "Dad didn't hurt you." But she knew the slow erosion of her spirit was enough. She didn't want to die invisible, so she began painting again. She laughed louder, she danced barefoot. Her family whispered about her midlife crisis, but it wasn't a crisis. It was resurrection. This is what it looks like when the soul reclaims the steering wheel. Jung warned us, as long as we define ourselves through the ego's lens, roles, achievements, approval, we remain enslaved by what the world expects. But when the ego cracks and the self emerges, life no longer asks, "How do I look to them?" but "How do I feel in me?" That question is dangerous to those who haven't asked it yet. It exposes their own numbness. That's why your awakening triggers discomfort. You remind them of the life they haven't dared to live. So ask yourself, are they uncomfortable because you're lost, or because they can no longer find you in the role you used to play? Is it laziness, or is it the exhaustion of performing a life that never fit? Could your quiet actually be the sound of your soul clearing space for what truly matters? This is not failure. This is fidelity to yourself. And though the world may never applaud this kind of courage, your soul will never forget the day you finally listened. What if you're not behind, but just being reborn? There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't scream. It whispers. It arrives after the chaos settles, when the old structures have collapsed, but the new ones have yet to emerge. You look around and feel behind in life. Your peers are advancing. Your phone no longer rings with opportunity. Even your own goals feel foreign. And in that haunting silence, a question forms. Did I miss my moment? Carl Jung would say no. In fact, he would say this is your moment. But it does not look like what the world celebrates. This phase, the psychological void, is not laziness or failure. It is incubation. It is the sacred womb of becoming. Jung himself entered such a phase after his break with Freud. For 6 years he appeared professionally dormant. Many assumed he had lost direction. But internally, he was journeying into the depths of his own unconscious, recording visions, drawing symbols, dialoguing with inner figures. From this darkness emerged the foundation of his life's work, the Red Book. His period of silence was not an ending, it was a return to origin. So if you feel directionless, exhausted, or numb, you are not late. You are not broken. You are dissolving the false motivations that once drove you and waiting for the true impulse to arise from within. This is not the death of purpose, but the purification of it. Consider a woman in her 40s who built her identity on achievement, promotions, accolades, applause. But one day, in the middle of a successful career, she hit a wall. The joy was gone. The goals that once lit her up now felt hollow. She tried to push through, but her body said no. Panic attacks, insomnia, emotional shutdown. Eventually, she stopped forcing herself and took a sabbatical. For months, she felt lost. But in that silence, she began writing poems, words she hadn't touched since childhood. Slowly, her soul returned, not to the boardroom, but to the page. That pause, which looked like failure to others, became the beginning of a life anchored in truth. Real transformation cannot be rushed. When we try to force productivity in the void, we create more masks, false urgency, shiny goals with empty souls. But the unconscious cannot be bullied. It unfolds in divine timing, and when it is ready, it sends a signal, not to your mind, but to your heart. A whisper, a calling, a deep inner yes that feels gentle but undeniable. So the question is not, how do I get back to who I was? But, what new truth is trying to emerge from who I am becoming? Are you willing to wait for a rhythm not ruled by the clock, but by your soul? Can you hold space for the emptiness without turning it into a performance? Could your deepest silence be the soil where the most authentic version of you finally takes root? This is the invitation of the void, to trust that your unfolding cannot be measured by comparison, only by alignment. You are not behind, you are being prepared. And the more still you become, the more clearly you'll hear what life has been trying to tell you all along. What if the very thing you're resisting is the thing that wants to heal you? When the old motivation dies, our first instinct is often panic. We fear we've lost ourselves. We scroll through productivity hacks, make endless to-do lists, or punish ourselves for resting. But the more we force movement, the more the soul retreats. This isn't just burnout, it's a sacred impasse, and if we dare to pause, we might realize it's not the end of us, but the beginning of our real self trying to break through. Carl Jung walked this path. After severing ties with Freud, he fell into what many would label a psychological collapse. But instead of treating this emptiness like a problem to fix, he treated it like a message to decode. He stopped trying to be productive in the outer world and began listening to the strange stirrings within. He turned inward, asking not, "What should I do?" but, "What wants to emerge through me today?" Jung's first practice was radical acceptance of the void. No judgment, no pressure, just space for the unknown. This was his sacred waiting room, where the ego loosened its grip and the unconscious found room to speak. His second practice was what he called active imagination. Each morning he engaged his inner world by drawing, writing, and conversing with symbolic figures from his dreams and waking visions. He did not dismiss them as fantasy, but treated them as fragments of his soul asking to be seen. He let the irrational speak. He let images lead. What surfaced weren't goals, but insights, truths too deep for language. Then came the third practice, what Jung called the transcendent function. Instead of choosing between what was safe and what was true, he held both, honoring the tension between his dying self and the self being born. He didn't collapse into despair or rush into reinvention. He allowed the contradiction. He sat in the middle, and in that sacred in-between, something new began to form, not from logic but from alchemy. His final practice was surrender to individuation. This wasn't about success or ambition. It was the quiet, patient return to his authentic center. He stopped asking how to prove himself and started asking how to become himself. And from that place, his life's work emerged, not for applause, but as an expression of truth. This is the real secret. What looks like giving up is often the first step of awakening. What seems like stagnation is actually transformation incubating beneath the surface. So the real question becomes, are you willing to let go of who you think you're supposed to be, long enough to become who you really are? Can you stop performing long enough to hear what your inner world is trying to say? What image, impulse, or whisper has been visiting you lately, not for achievement, but for truth? Jung's journey wasn't linear, neither is yours, but the soul doesn't need straight lines. It needs space. And when you stop pushing, you start listening. And when you start listening, something beautiful begins to unfold, not from effort, but from alignment. So, what if you didn't lose your motivation? What if you simply stopped chasing what never truly belonged to you? There comes a moment, often quiet and unannounced, when your soul begins refusing to run the old programs. The goals that once lit a fire in your chest now feel hollow. The applause you used to crave feels distant, irrelevant. And the dreams you once idolized begin to crumble, not in failure but in liberation. This isn't a collapse. This is clarity. You're not lazy. You're awakening. Carl Jung reminds us that we do not become whole by clinging to the light, but by entering the darkness and reclaiming what was hidden. The emptiness you feel is not a void to escape, but a womb of potential. The part of you that no longer fits the old world is not broken. It is rebirthing. And what others may label as losing yourself is often the shedding of all that was never you to begin with. This is why the silence feels uncomfortable. You are no longer powered by projection, no longer animated by pleasing others. The old self was shaped by the hunger to belong. But this new self, it hungers for truth. It would rather walk alone in authenticity than be loved for a mask. That shift, subtle at first, changes everything. It breaks the spell. The moment you stopped performing was the moment your real life began. This inner death is sacred. The motivation you lost was never truly yours. It was borrowed energy, crafted by culture, conditioned by trauma, fed by the illusion that if you did enough, you'd finally be enough. But something deeper cracked open, something real. And in that space where the noise once lived, you now hear your soul whispering, not louder, but clearer. You've outgrown the old map. And now, instead of asking what path to take, you ask what is emerging from within. This is the gift of the void. It is not an absence. It is presence, stripped of agenda. The absence of false drive reveals the presence of sacred direction, not rushed, not rehearsed, but remembered. It was always there, waiting beneath the roles, behind the masks, beyond the chase. So now, as you sit in this in-between season, can you trust that nothing is wrong with you? Can you allow yourself to not know and still be enough? Can you make space for the truth that your emptiness is not your failure, it's your freedom? Because when you stop running from the silence, you start hearing your soul. And once your soul starts speaking, there's no going back to performing. This is individuation in motion. This is Jung's message to us all. Your soul was never meant to be productive. It was meant to be true. And now, it finally is. If this touched something sacred inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your presence here is not just support, it's resonance. And if you feel moved to give back, your donation becomes a quiet but powerful gesture that helps keep this light alive for others still walking in the dark.